Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most crucial and often the most contested questions in divorce when it comes to the finances. What exactly is included in the matrimonial pot? Now, the matrimonial pot is really looking at what you're going to divide when you come to making a financial agreement. And the question is, what do you include, what do you not include, and what's up for grabs? And this is usually something that's quite contentious. It's the first step in any financial conversations, is defining that matrimonial pot, because you can't talk about how you're going to divide assets until you know what exactly you have. It's not uncommon for people to get stuck on this aspect and they can't even get to the next bit, which is discussing how to split things. So it's definitely a sticky subject for a lot of people. Now, we're going to talk today about a case that came out recently, which is called Standish versus Standish, and that's brought renewed attention to how the courts define non-matrimonial assets, and it's shifted things slightly. So we're going to talk about that as well. So to talk about all this and to explore in a bit more detail what the matrimonial pot is and how do you define what's in and what's out, I've invited Amy Fox. And Amy is a partner in the family team at Pennington's Manches Cooper, and she has experience in all aspects of legal issues arising from relationship breakdown, including the financial consequences of separation. Now, Amy has particular expertise in complex financial disputes, often with an international element. So Standish versus Standish is going to be very relevant to you. And welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing the latest from you. But maybe we start with the big picture. For those who are less aware of how things work in practice in England and Wales with regards to the finances, what is the matrimonial pot, and why does it matter so much?
Well, I think to a certain extent you've covered it in your introduction brilliantly. The matrimonial pot is really the total value of the assets available for division in divorce. And it's really important because if you don't know what assets there are available to divide, you can't possibly know how they should be divided. So without that, we have nothing in lots of ways. And the way that we normally get to the bottom of what's in the matrimonial pot is through disclosure. So we fill in these long documents called a Form E, and you set out every single asset that you have an interest in, and then you exchange that with your spouse. And from that, we draw out the values of the assets and put them in an asset schedule. So in some ways, the pot is relatively simple for us in terms of the fact that it is just an asset schedule that we look at, and then we from there decide or advise as to how those assets should be divided, really.
It comes from the fact that there are some shades of gray. So maybe we start with the things that are clearly in. So for people to be clear about which elements are non-negotiable, in the vast majority of cases, they will be considered matrimonial. What would that typically include?
So generally, matrimonial assets are the assets which have been built up during the marriage. So assets which derive from one party's income that they've earned during the marriage, shares that have been bought during the marriage with income generated during the marriage, anything that is basically part of a shared endeavor. Basically, if you've worked together, and that doesn't mean that one person that if you're both not earning, you're not both contributing to that endeavor. So one person could be looking after the children at home and the other person going out earning the money. That money that they earn during the marriage is still a matrimonial asset. So I think that's a really important thing to
an
know.
Important point, even with regards to having your name on certain things. Yeah. I think people think, the house is in my name, so it's mine. But that doesn't actually matter in terms of whether it's matrimonial or not.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's something you referred to the case of Standish, and that's something that actually came across very clearly in that case. So going back to, because you asked me what's definitely in, yeah. So assets that are obviously part of the shared endeavor, then you have the matrimonial home. Now, even if that is an asset that was brought in with pre-acquired wealth, in the vast majority of cases, that will be a matrimonial asset, and will be part of the assets that are subject to sharing. And that's because you live in your matrimonial home as a family. It's seen by everyone really as a matrimonial asset. So even if you didn't pay any money towards it and it was all premarital, that is still a matrimonial asset. And then there's also the element of your pension that you built up during the marriage. And that is very much a matrimonial asset as well. So those are the assets which very much fall into the definition of matrimonial, I would say. And one thing I would say, and I'm sure you're probably going to ask about this, but the definition of matrimonial and non-matrimonial, the reason why that is so important is because of the way the courts will then treat those assets. Different principles apply to the different types of assets. So that's really important.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that because there's also the concept of matrimonialization, which just adds to the mix, right? So
yes, all the jargon. Family lawyers love a bit of jargon.
So there can be an evolution of an asset which might be originally non-matrimonial, but then it would be matrimonialized and then find its way into the pot. So that's the extra complexity that we're going to get to when we talk about Standish, and which makes everything a little bit less clear, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked about what's in. What's definitely out? Is that clearly defined?
So it is subject to, as you say, the matrimonialization element, which we will cover. Non-matrimonial property is property which isn't the fruits of your sort of joint endeavours. So it will be assets which you had before the marriage, and as I'm sure, well, not as I'm sure people may be aware, but a marriage in family law starts from when you start cohabiting. So it would be assets that you had before you started cohabiting. Also, any gifts that you receive that are from, say, family or inheritance. So all of those assets would potentially be non-matrimonial, but what will be very important as to whether they remain non-matrimonial is how they're treated during the marriage. And that's kind of what comes out of Standish.
If they're used for the purposes of the family life of the marriage, or if they're kept isolated, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So what else is in the gray zone? You mentioned pensions. I know inheritance is a tricky one. Can we touch a bit on those?
Yeah. So pensions. The generally accepted sort of concept is that pensions that are built up prior to the marriage will not be invaded. But again, they may be invaded if one party needs some of that pension in order to meet their needs. And I think this is probably a sensible point for me to explain the different principles that apply to matrimonial or to the assets generally. So the court will apply the principle of sharing to matrimonial assets. So that is the idea that the starting point is that all assets built up during the marriage should be shared on a 50-50 basis. And that's a fairly sort of straightforward approach. The second principle is the principle of needs, so that the court needs to make sure basically that both parties' needs are met. And so that means that you can have a departure from equality to meet needs. So a really good example of this would be, say, there's a couple, and I'm just going to be very gender stereotypical, but it doesn't need to be this way. But the wife is at home looking after the children, so she doesn't have a mortgage raising capacity, and the husband does. If let's say they have a property and the equity in it is, say, £1 million, if they're going to buy properties of an equal standard, the wife may need more than 50% of the family home, the equity in the family home, to meet her needs, because she doesn't have a mortgage raising capacity, whereas the husband does. So in that case, the court will look at what both parties needs, and that may justify a departure away from a 50-50 division. And that needs concept is important when it comes to non-matrimonial property as well. And then the third principle, which is vanishingly rare and very unusual to find in cases, is or very unusual to find it successfully argued, is compensation. And that again is where one party, let's say the man in this case, has given up their career their very, very successful career to look after the children, and they've got what's called a relationship generated disadvantage. And the other party has earned or has a very, very good income and has done brilliantly in their career. The party who has given up their career may say that they should be compensated for the loss of that. As I say, it's very rare and it's a very difficult argument to run. So you don't see it that often. And that, again, if you have non-matrimonial property, you can have a claim for compensation, but you can't have a claim over non-matrimonial property for sharing, or the principle of sharing doesn't apply to non-matrimonial property. That was a lot of law, sorry.
No, very helpful. And just to kind of clarify, make sure I understood this properly. Anything that is non-matrimonial can become matrimonial if needs are met. So if needs are met, then it's a sharing principle that applies. Is that correct?
So it won't necessarily become matrimonial.
Okay.
You may have a claim over it. You don't. So non-matrimonial property, you don't necessarily have any entitlement to that property. You may have some entitlement to it if you can show that you need to have it.
Understood.
So if there was not enough money to buy a house and someone had inherited, say, like £500,000, you could say, well, I need some of that money in order to buy a property. But what you're not entitled to with non-matrimonial property is to share it. If that non-matrimonial property becomes matrimonialized, sorry, so much legal jargon, then it's matrimonial property and it's subject to the sharing principle. So, yeah.
So it's not in the matrimonial pot, but it has an influence in how assets will be split and might be bring further from the 50-50.
Exactly.
So we've used the word matrimonialization a few times now. Can you explain a little bit what it is, and especially what's been happening with Standish versus Standish and how that's kind of shifted things?
Yeah, of course. So Standish versus Standish is, for family lawyers, a very exciting and interesting case. Maybe not for generally everybody else, but it's basically, in that case, the assets were huge. There was a sort of in excess of £100 million. And shortly before the parties separated, the husband transferred to the wife 77 million. And importantly, these funds derived from funds which were premarital. So the wife they hadn't been built up during the marriage. They were completely separate, effectively. Also, importantly, the husband transferred them for tax saving purposes. And it was intended that they would then be put into a trust for the parties' children, which actually never happened. Mm-hmm. So, spoiler alert, in that case, the courts found that just because those assets had been transferred to the wife, they didn't become matrimonialized. And in fact, so her claim was limited, and she couldn't share in that 77 million effectively. So I'm just, we're going to refer to some of the quotes from Standish, because I think they're really, well, as I said earlier, the Supreme Court justices do a much better job of explaining stuff than I do. But effectively, what starts as non-matrimonial property can become matrimonial property. And in Standish, what they do is they look at sort of the three, in fact, actually four, but three main circumstances in which that happens. And so they say that with respect to Lady Hale, who's a very well-esteemed previous judge, I believe that the true proposition is that the importance of the source of the assets may diminish over time. And then they give three situations. So one is that over time, matrimonial property of such value has been acquired as to diminish the significance of the initial contribution by one spouse of non-matrimonial property. And so I think an example of that would be, say, you buy a holiday home and one party contributes £20,000 to it, let's say, but over time, the income that both parties generate means that they are able to pay off the entire mortgage, which let's say is £1 million. At that point, the £20,000 has been completely dwarfed by the £1 million. And it's very difficult to work out exactly what that £20,000 would be worth now and how you'd extract it. And the court basically says it's not fair in those circumstances to try and spend the time and the money looking at what that would now be worth, because it's been so dwarfed by non-matrimonial property. So the second point, which I think which is probably the most relevant in lots of circumstances, is over time, the non-matrimonial property initially contributed has been mixed with matrimonial property in circumstances in which the contributor may be said to have accepted that it should be treated as matrimonial property, or in which, at any rate, the task of identifying its current value is too difficult. So that would be, for example, you inherit a sum of money, you transfer it into the joint account, and then you pay it out into various different, investments, or into, again, a holiday home. And so it's impossible really to trace where it's all gone. And so in those circumstances, it would become matrimonial. Okay. And the third instance is the one that I was talking about earlier, which is the matrimonial home. So if you've contributed to the matrimonial home, even if it's in your sole, the other party's sole, if it's in your sole name, it will over time be treated by the parties as a central item of matrimonial property. So in those circumstances, that would become a matrimonial asset or matrimonialized.
Is that immediate then? Because we often see cases where one party will move into the other person's house.
Yes.
How soon does that become a matrimonial asset? Is there a definite period of time?
So I think that's a really good question. There's no specific period of time. And so this answer is going to be slightly vague, but it's sort of over a period of time. I think, say you moved in and you broke up or you separated within a year, then I think that the family home would not be matrimonialized in those circumstances. But if it was maybe after 5 years, if you'd had children, all of those factors, then I think it definitely would be matrimonialized. So I think
what are the intent then, how the asset is used?
Exactly. I think exactly that. And they do say that somewhere in their judgment, which I have written down but can't find it right at this precise moment.
And so when we think of matrimonialization, it's an asset that originally wasn't matrimonial, but the way it was used and intended to be used has tinted it in a way, or it's muddied the waters anyway, to a point where actually it becomes impossible to disassociate it from matrimonial assets, and it just naturally merges into that category. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. So there's actually a really helpful quote in the judgment from a passage from Peter Duckworth, Matrimonial Property and Finance, which says, a better view may be that matrimonial property is not something that is predetermined at the outset of a marriage, but is governed by the parties' intentions and how they treat the relevant asset over a period of time. Thus, where a party has demonstrated an intention to use an inheritance for the benefit of the family, by translating it into actual use and enjoyment, the parties have elected to treat it as matrimonial property, even if its origin was from outside the marriage. So exactly what you said, basically. But
that was one of the big factors in Standish, is that he never intended for that money to be his wife's. It was purely for tax purposes, and so that's why it was
exactly. And so what they're looking at is what is the intention of the use of the funds, as you say. And that will determine whether or not it's become matrimonialized.
Yeah. So to come back to an earlier example, say inheritance. So if I inherit an asset, say I inherit a house from my parents before I get married, as long as I keep that house completely separate from my marriage and my family, it's only mine. But if, for example, my family and I move into that house, or if my husband contributes to works and construction in the house, that kind of thing, then it becomes tinted, and that argument of matrimonialization could come up, and it could find its way into the pot.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. If you started to use it as your family home, then I think that would be make it definitely a matrimonial property. And also, if you did works to it, I think it would depend on how extensive the work was. But the more something becomes mingled, so the more you can contribute it, the more your spouse's funds are paid into it, the harder it is to see the line between what was non-matrimonial and matrimonial. And so, yes, you definitely would be in danger of it becoming matrimonialized, I think.
So what was the big change then with Standish versus Standish? How is this different to what was happening in court before?
Well, in some respects, it wasn't that big a change. Yeah. I think it's because the court, it upheld the Court of Appeal judgment, but for different reasons. So, for some different reasons. So in some respects, it's not that different to the way that family practitioners were approaching matrimonial and not matrimonial property in any event. I think what it does do is very much kind of set out very clearly what is matrimonial and non-matrimonial. It says things such as that the sharing principle doesn't apply to non-matrimonial assets, and which is really important. And it says that it's long been recognised that it's not determinative who has held the property, like who has the title to the property. So I think that's quite helpful. But yeah, it hasn't. I mean, in some respects, it's not a huge difference to the law that was being applied previously. Actually, I think it just has helped provide clarity on the situation.
Then people have a little bit more certainty around what might be treated as a matrimonial asset, what might not.
And it has the sort of examples that we just ran through and a kind of checklist of what might make something, what might matrimonialize an asset effectively. So that is really helpful. And it succinctly describes or summarizes the law, which is also helpful for practitioners.
You know where you stand.
Yes,
it's not exactly. All that often in family law, actually, that you have that kind of clarity.
Yeah, so, exactly.
On the head to kind of turn it into some practical tips. What can people do up front, during the marriage, or even before getting married, to protect non-matrimonial assets if they want to really make sure that they aren't included in that matrimonial pot should the marriage break down?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. So I think that the two main things you can do, the first is obviously to keep it separate. So to make sure that you don't have any opportunity for somebody to argue that it's matrimonialized. So you make sure it's not paid into a joint account, that you don't pay it into the family home, all of those types of things. And the second is definitely to enter into a prenuptial or postnuptial agreement. And it's important to highlight that they are not binding in England and Wales, but they are very likely to be upheld if certain factors are in place, and that is that both parties have legal advice, that there's no duress, so it's not signed the day before the wedding or the day of the wedding, for example, that there's financial disclosure, and then that it's fair. And fair is a slightly elastic concept, so it's difficult to sort of set out exactly what that would mean, but both parties need to be met. I think it's also
as well, doesn't it? If you've stipulated that an asset is not going to be, part of the matrimonial pot, it does reinforce that case.
Exactly, and the courts very much see that you're two adults sort of entering into agreement, and you can make a decision about these things. I think it's also important to highlight that. So there's obviously prenuptial agreements, which everyone sort of knows about and has heard about, but you can have a postnuptial agreement, which does exactly the same thing as a prenuptial agreement. You just, after you're married. And actually, in some respects, they can be even more likely to be upheld because you don't have that element of the kind of rushing before a wedding to sign the agreement. And they're really helpful in cases where, for example, you've been married for a few years, your parents say, oh, we want to give you some money, but we don't necessarily want your spouse to be entitled to it because actually it's really for the grandchildren or whatever. So in those circumstances, you can then enter into agreement which specifies that will be kept separate and won't form part of the assets to be divided. And that would protect, as far as it's possible to do so, those funds. So they are very useful documents.
Certain assets in that context.
Sorry,
you can ring fence some of your assets in that context.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. That's really, really helpful. I had one last question because it's come up recently with a client with regards to non-matrimonial assets. If an asset, say, so going back to my example, I've inherited this house from my parents before the marriage, but we are living as a family off of the income of renting that house.
Okay.
Does that create a matrimonial intent, or does that still not come into play?
So that would be that would definitely fall into a grey area. I mean, I think you could have good argument to say that if you're living off the rent, you're not. That is the rental income rather than the actual capital value of that asset. So I think you could potentially say, and I believe there is case law about this, but I can't off the top of my head remember what the case is called. But I believe that there are definitely arguments you could put forward as to the fact that rental income is effectively separate from the capital value that's derived from the asset. So yeah, I think as long as you're not living in the property, or obviously you're not because you're renting it out. So yeah.
So I guess that goes to show just how complex it is, and how there's just a lot of shades of grey, and really the value in getting legal advice on these kind of things if you're not sure.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's what's really important. Actually, if you're about to come into a lot of money, or even not a lot of money, a sum of money, or you're about to get married and you have a lot of premarital assets, I think it's really important to get legal advice to try and protect those assets. If that's what you want to do, you may not. Yeah. You may be very happy for them to be shared, but if you want to protect them, then you must get legal advice. And I would say that if you're contemplating getting married, get that legal advice as far in advance of your wedding as possible. You do not want to be signing a prenuptial agreement in the days before your wedding, because it's so stressful and it's not what you want to be doing. So yeah.
Oh, and it'll be discredited somewhat by that factor as well.
Yeah, exactly. And if that does happen, then you want to get a postnuptial agreement as well. But
so speak to a lawyer as soon as you can, especially if there's
a lawyer. Yeah,
that want to be protected.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. It was great to have you, and thanks for sharing all those insights.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.